First of all, we have to go back a little ways before we actually start talking about the Industrial Revolution. Not too far back though, just to the very early 18th century, during what was called the Cottage Industry. See, Europe was fresh out of its agricultural revolution, where things like seed drills and other tools were being used to make farming a lot more efficient, and just generally faster. This is a time where the French Revolution is happening. People like Mozart and Bach are alive and kicking, and the world is kind of in this weird growth period. So anyways, the agricultural revolution happens and suddenly there's a lot more food everywhere. With more food comes more people, and with more people comes the need for clothes, which means more textiles, which means, well, you get it. So, what was the answer to this newfound demand for clothing and fabric making? Well, the agricultural revolution also made the need for farmers significantly less. So you've got a sudden need for textiles and a bunch of people out in rural 18th century Europe who need jobs. Basically, some merchant dudes realized, wait, I could make a ton of money if I swing this right, and so the cottage industry was born. It involved a few things, the first being an entrepreneur, or someone who would invest in their system and buy a bunch of raw materials that needed to be processed, wool, stone, wood, etc. Then this entrepreneur would go to different houses, cottages, and drop off the supplies. Say he'd be back in like a week, and leave the household to do their part of the chain. When he came back a week later, he'd take the processed supplies and scoot off to the next house, where they would take care of the next step in processing. And he would repeat this until finally he had the stuff he wanted to sell. Then he'd go to the nearest market, sell off all his goods, buy new goods and repeat the cycle, while also paying the various cottages a portion of the earnings. I explain all this because it does eventually lead into, and even directly cause, the Industrial Revolution. In fact, this system led to the very creation of capitalism. Okay, so we've got people working to make sellable goods, a head honcho selling everything and keeping everyone in line, and a now pretty saturated market. Doesn't that sound a little familiar? Well, it should, because it's the beginnings, and what would evolve into the factory system. This new burst of income and lack of farmers meant that people could spend time doing something other than just farming, which led to new markets and industries such as shoemakers, haberdashers, sculptors, and so on all became increasingly popular as people began having not only the time, but also the money to invest in their own businesses. And now, just as someone had before, someone gets the idea, hey, you know what would make this go a lot faster? Machines. Inventions like James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and Samuel Crompton's mule made everything insanely efficient. But bigger is better, right? So far all these machines had fit into the cottages of the workers, but when people started making bigger, better, faster machines, they needed places to put them. These being things like the power loom and water frame. Thus warehouses were built to hold multiple, huge machines, and workers were to come out of their homes and work in the factories. This all caused a bunch of things, most namely a new demand for coal, B, housing for all the workers who were traveling from their rural villages, and C, more effective transportation for said works, and also for the supplies. This is actually where a bunch of the problems started. For one, these workers were already typically pretty underpaid working in their homes, but they went with it because they liked having the money without having to work in the fields, or buy more property to have fields to work in. Then, when people dropped the cottage industry and instead forced people to come in from the rural countryside, they didn't really have the money to move into the city, which caused a decline in workers until workhouses became popular. Now, I use the term workhouses lightly, because they really weren't close to nice enough to be a house. Most of the time it was a big open warehouse, where all the workers would sleep on the floor packed tightly together. They were fed the barest minimum the factory owners could get away with, and usually suffered from horrible diseases thanks to the close proximity, overworking, and lack of sufficient nutrients. It was really bad. And it became a popular practice to sell your children to factories, because they needed small bodies to clean out the machines. The children, usually aged 4 to 10ish, would be forced to work as long, or sometimes longer than the adults, and were fed less. Their jobs also tended to be dangerous, and loss of limbs or death was horrifyingly common. This actually led to a bunch of child labor laws being instituted to prevent shit like this from happening again. All of this is happening, and now Europe is mass producing all these goods that were typically exported out of the country. The biggest problem with this, though, was that horse-drawn carriage became much too tedious of a transportation way, and the bumpy roads could even damage the goods and lessen their profit. So, people began to invent alternatives. And the government became involved and implemented road building laws when it started realizing that the random I'm building a road here, because I feel like its system could become problematic. These new roads were usually made with stones, or later on asphalt over stone, and were way smoother rides. This wasn't enough though, and soon people began building canals, and eventually railroads. So now we have big rich guys running factories and mass producing goods, actual roads and now trains and railroads, and a bunch of people being worked to the bone and underpaid, and capitalism. That's fun. The Industrial Revolution created jobs, efficient transportation, less need for farmers, and a brand new competitive economy. So while it was, well, revolutionary, we've got it to thank for some choice issues.